Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out for another wonderful citizen science. My name is Professor Carrie Fioramonti. I am an assistant professor of biology in the Natural Science Division, and we have been hosting citizen science for a number of years now. Oh, where'd Linda go? Where'd she go? There you are. Yeah, like 2012, somewhere in there. So we're looking at like 8 years, going on our 8th year of citizen science seminars. So this is also a collaboration between Gulf Coast State College and St. Andrew Baywatch. So if you have any questions at all about St. Andrew Baywatch, formerly known as St. Andrew Bay Resource Management Association, please feel free to ask me any questions after the presentation. I'll be happy to try to get some answers for you. I also wanted to let you guys know that if you did need to use the restrooms, they are right through this door over here, okay? What I'd like to do now is I do want to give our player a proper introduction. Many of you guys actually know who is going to be putting on this show this afternoon. Is Professor Jason Hedden. He is the chair of Visual and Performing Arts here at Gulf Coast State College. And he's going to be performing a work that he wrote, directed, produced, and performs himself. This is part of his graduate work. And I'd like to read you a brief summary of this performance. Resurrecting Van Gogh is an original performance based on the life, work, and writings of Andy Martin, a medical student and oncology patient at Tulane University, who conducted groundbreaking research on sino-nasal undifferentiated carcinoma, an extremely rare form of cancer. Under the supervision of Dr. Tyler Curiel, Andy was able to grow his own cancer cells in the lab and establish a permanent cell line to allow important research to continue. The majority of the performance text is taken directly from Andy's unpublished private journals with permission from the Martin family. And so without any further ado, I would like to invite Jason out to perform Resurrecting Van Gogh.
She joined me on a backpacking trip through Sequoia National Park to fish and attempt Mount Whitney. On our first night, I explained that the most important part of golden trout, besides fresh garlic, was the Chardonnay. I removed the Erath Vineyards 1996 from my pack and placed it in the cold stream feeding the lake. We feasted like kings that night on the freshest fish imaginable, basmati rice, and perfectly chilled wine. The future, our future, was unclear. Medical school loomed in my future, and many uncertainties loomed in hers. August 20th, 2000. The state of affairs. Cancer in my nose that's going to require surgery. Insurance that won't yet cover the surgery here in Louisiana, but will cover it in Los Angeles. Medical school has just gotten underway. I've just about all the way settled in. The workload is good size, but entirely manageable. I've been studying 3 to 4 hours per day for 4 hours, and I feel like I'm just about on top of it. My family has been supportive all the way about the cancer, and everyone seems willing to fly out here should I have the surgery done. Having fun here. Deeper friendships obviously take months and years, not days and weeks. But I'm having fun and enjoying myself and going out. I need to deal with the insurance issue. My life changed from a nosebleed. It originated in a growth in the middle of my left frontal sinus. I was extremely lucky. I had taken another mountain climbing trip to an altitude that forced a nosebleed. Surgeon who performed the operation was astounded. In a 20-year career, he'd gone in after a bleed and found tumor one other time. That's what, 2 procedures a week? 20 years, 2,000 procedures? It's a pretty low percentage. Plus, I was 27 at the time. I'd never been a smoker. I didn't have any other immune compromise paving the way for a tumor to develop. It was simply unlucky. Some cells had divided to mutate into something cancerous and then do what cancer does: grow without stopping. But my surgery was successful, and any resemblance I used to have to Harry Potter just got much improved. I had round, dark glasses, light green eyes, and a shock of mean and unruly brown locks, and a zigzag scar on my face. I could tell when my surgeon was near because my scar would hurt. I could envision him grittily muttering a la Voldemort, "Must operate on Andy Martin's nose." But seriously, the doc who did the cutting did a series of W-shaped cuts that looked like a lightning bolt. For a week and a half, I looked like a street fighter, or perhaps a vain young Hollywood star desperate for facial perfection. My eye was black and swollen, and my face on that side puffy and tender. Oh. I also had a chronically crying left eye. It was watery all the time. The itty-bitty tears we all regularly produce to moisten the eyes weren't draining into the sinuses like normal. But fortunately, some folks had scheduled 16 days of international sporting events in Sydney, Australia, for the week following my surgery so that I would have something engaging to watch. Let me tell you, there have been no more moving set of those athlete profiles in history. I cried out of my left eye for each and every one. And I cried my saddest left eye tears for the profile of Ian Thorpe's buddy. The Torpedo was a huge star on the Australian swim team. His buddy, who had leukemia, was shown bald in the hospital during a course of treatment. Leukemia is a grim disease with a prognosis far worse and treatment more arduous than the cancer that I was dealing with. If anyone came into medical school with their motor running, it was yours truly. And I wasted precious few moments after I returned from treatment. Dealing with cancer always involves new and unexpected milestones of joy and relief. And after my gross anatomy class that semester, I was really feeling it. I'd arrived in med school and done well. If my left eye were still weepy, it probably would have cried a tear of joy. I did well in medical school, but I hated to make a mistake. That was one of my biggest frustrations, my inability to let mistakes go quickly enough. Part of it was that I felt like in healthcare, one shouldn't make mistakes, which is true. But healthcare workers are just as human as everyone else. Cancer treatment took its toll on my body, but the gray clouds yielded a silver lining. During treatment, I lost 25 pounds, but I managed to keep it off. My muscles had no pulling power for rock climbing, but damn if I couldn't hang on to absolutely everything. So I'd been given this odd opportunity at self-reinvention to climb stuff I might never have been light enough to climb. So I worked hard to restore mass to my atrophied pulling muscles. I thought I'd maybe even crank one of those one-arm pull-ups. My doctors had done their part to keep me together. If I didn't take this opportunity to extend myself, then I only had myself to hold accountable. And I loved being behind the wheel. My one-year follow-up visit showed no signs of residual tumor, making my prognosis nearly as good as if I'd never been sick. And I almost did a complete one-arm pull-up. But my cancer came back. And this time it had a new name. Sinonasal undifferentiated carcinoma, or SNUC, is a rare and highly aggressive neoplasm arising from the nasal cavity. Fewer than 100 patients have ever been diagnosed, and there appear to only be a handful alive in the U.S. at any one time. Even if there was a why, it was so obscured from my view that it was not relevant. What I realized, in unsettlingly clear terms, is just how I would spend the time I might have left to live. What I realized is that sticking to the path of becoming a doctor was still the most important goal to me. And one of the things I most feared losing if treatment proved unsuccessful. My fear of losing the opportunity to practice medicine caused me to suffer more than the treatment. My first time through cancer treatment, I simply had utter faith in my doctors. The second time through, I had utter faith that I was better and smarter than the doctors at UCLA. And that somewhere in the U.S. there had to be people as talented as me, or more, who had the years of training I had not yet had, who could carry out what seemed to be undeniably possible. The third time, I had no faith that anyone had anything other than guesswork. Unlike the first two times through cancer, when the doctors were so much like deities. The third time, just a bunch of honest-to-goodness human beings who had no more idea of the right set of decisions than I did. We were all so fallible, so less than perfect, so impotent despite all our human abilities. We're just a bunch of people who want a certain outcome and who don't have the scientific tools to achieve it reliably. It's so very humbling. August 30th, 2003. I'm worried about my mood. I've had more thoughts that I'm going to die soon. What would I like from my life? More exercise, climbing, more reading papers and books, not cable internet junk. Meet more people, even if slowly. More investment in my friendships. October 10th, 2003. All MDs have been in my spot, third-year student. Most haven't had a rare cancer. Do I truly expect to cure my disease? There's no cell line. There are almost no studies due to rarity. I'd started to feel split by a desire to see and experience this world and a desire to solve my problem for myself. I felt like in terms of hope and optimism that every time I stood up, I got knocked down again, over and over. It had become so routine that I'd come to expect it. I think that's one of the reasons why I tended toward ease, to climb or dream about surfing. Also, though, is this almost contradictory urge to research snuck as long as I was able. The more articles I read, the more it appeared to me as this almost absurdly ill-defined entity. So little was really known. October 22nd, 2003. The research project with Dr. Curiel looks like it's going to happen really soon. We don't need institutional review board approval because we used my tumor. So we can do it as soon as we like. Looks like Friday or Monday. I think I'll probably end up learning a lot through this whole experience, but I need to find some way to tell people so I don't feel so closed, but I'm still able to deflect the attention elsewhere. November 22nd, 2003. My cells are alive in the lab. And there's some minimal amount of proliferation, but they're definitely not going to town, growing up out of the wells begging to be studied. We changed media yesterday to some special expensive stuff with all sorts of growth factors. Time will tell. It's not easy to sit and wait when I still believe there's an outside shot at curing this thing in the lab. During that time, I was surrounded by an amazing community of people who really knew how to dig deep and support their own. I remember the head shaving party. That particular night was special, not only because it was so intimate, but because it was so unexpectedly large and wonderful and personal. Everybody who participated was in my class, so I knew them all really well. In the aftermath of that event was the inevitable confrontation with what's left over after the flood of public support. It was nice to get the support, but it made the pit of interim loneliness seem deeper and darker than it was before. During that time, I had started to grow more confident in my ability to trust my own judgment. And I realized that I was about to enter a career field that could not offer me a cure. The degree of disappointment that represented was earth-shaking. I can't say I'd recommend that everyone that has a cancer should jump out and try and research it, because it was taxing. But this was snuck. It was a disease that had not been cultured. It was a disease that was not understood. It was a disease that nobody else was going to take on. And it was a disease that I might die of. November 30th, 2003. I thought a lot about the cancer business, and it makes me nervous. Setting personal ground rules for what I will and won't say is at least some hedge against an excess of intrusion in personal life. Rule number 1, no talking about it at parties and social events. Rule number 2, no talking about it at school or in a public setting. Oops. Due to the radiation treatments, my mouth had become a slippery confection of excessively thick saliva and open, oozing ulcers. I began to fear eating, as well as speaking. The worst misery of the treatment had begun to emerge. I quit rock climbing and tried to settle into the notion of being a patient. That may have been my biggest struggle, that surrender. The notion of the sick role rang in my head every time I was forced by illness to prevail on the good graces of family and friends and professionals for their help. My loathing for the passivity of it rose in me like a fierce heartburn. I was a future doctor and convinced that it was my responsibility to fight disease and no one else's. Fighting cancer isn't much of a fight, really. Fighting cancer is done by MDs and RNs, and a patient is left to fight the side effects as best they can. That's the big fight in cancer treatment. You take the treatment on the chin, and you do your best to keep your dukes up while your knees do a great impression of a wobbly drunk. You can take a knee, try and shake the cobwebs out of your head, but there's no acquiescence. Losing to symptoms means quitting treatment, which means losing to cancer. And in addition to winding up dead, disappointing the hell out of one's loved ones for one's weak chin and untimely demise. December 12th, 2003. The research is going really, really slow, beyond frustration into stagnation. The fact that the Bounce for Life fundraiser has put me in touch with other cancer patients has revealed new productive ways to put this effort to good use. By providing a website with patient-friendly information that can make our site a hub of activity for patients with rare cancers. I realize SNUC patients aren't alone in this process of isolation. Community has been a really important part of this process, particularly since it's the theme of greatest meaning for me these days, and one that I think is most useful for rare cancers. It's also the greatest value of this whole Bounce for Life thing for other patients. The spark of hope. At least they know they're not alone in their struggle. Being able to spearhead this is a real charge and a worthy 6-month to 1-year goal. So, this whole predicament I was in was one of heroism. And how to convince myself that I could do something unheard of. It was a private battle, because if I couldn't convince others that I had confidence in my own research efforts, I feared they might not show me the optimism I needed to nurture my own fledgling confidence. Truth be told, I often feared I wouldn't survive that recurrence, and that I wouldn't discover anything useful in the lab. If the research efforts didn't bear immediate fruit, then I'd just as soon have dropped it and gone climbing or surfing for a while. December 28th, 2003. What do I want to have done by the start of 2005? Carve a bottom turn, cut a line down a wave, and pull out on the shoulder before getting closed out, all on the same ride, no piecemeal success. Publish at least one more non-scientific article. Host at least one more wine tasting now that I've discovered my taste for wine in the capacity that's appealing without a sense of smell. In early 2004 in Chicago, I had a surgery to try to remove a tumor. They were unsuccessful in removing all of the cancer cells. January 17th, 2004. I had a hard week, returning to the lab after 3 weeks away, half expecting that the biopsy from Chicago would have instantly become 15 independently growing cell lines, not to be. To be or not to be. There are so few cells that it's absurd. I finally managed to get different media types going yesterday and have been working hard to get a multi-institution review paper going, but it's the painful slowness of the lab work that ground away at my exuberance this past week. This is the real battle for me, the one for a steady emotional state. At times, the process was fraught with highs and lows that were nearly unbearable. It helped to remind myself that what we were doing held promise for others. And in that lays its nobility. And this must suffice until such time as we can celebrate the elimination of this disease. I look forward to one day sharing that moment with all of you. I was in debilitating pain and fever, and I realized I needed to step back and be a patient. So for 8 weeks, I really stepped all the way back and took my hands off the wheel. And it was very, very liberating. January 24th, 2004, very, very late, past 3 a.m., Just finished hosting another wine party. These have just gotten better as they've gone along. We tasted port, Ruby Red, 10 to 20-year tawny, and 2 bottles of vintage port. Nora Jones on the CD player, me crying. Come away with me. One of the best parts of those few months was the friendship that developed with Dr. Curiel after the Bounce for Life event. With wine and cancer as common interest, and I like to think a degree of mutual inspiration. It was really fun getting to know him and his family. At that point, we had enough of my cells stored away in cold storage that we could try for a good while to get the line started. It would be more art than science, and if we had needed to resurrect Van Gogh to facilitate the process, we would have. Once cancer cells can be reliably grown, we can learn how they behave and then how to eliminate them. October 18th, 2004. Happy birthday. Tomorrow I'm 32 years old. I think there's a part of me that thinks I may never treat a patient. But there's really no time to waste hovering over that.
This disease likes to hide in obscure places to avoid cure and come back again at a later date.
He was still wearing his blue stocking hat. He was sleeping, and I said his name and touched his shoulder. Andy had a way of looking at you that was intense. He focused on you. Even that day, he was sick and in bed. He still had that same intensity in his gaze, even though he was sedated and the pain was distracting him.
Dealing with his own cancer, he was often disgusted with the old-fashioned concept of, I am the doctor and you are the patient and I'll tell you what to do relationship. He was fighting that with everything in his body. I was told by many of his classmates how Andy had changed the way they saw their roles as healers.
I told him he should be proud of the work he had left behind, because it was making a difference. Andy taught me to see my patient as a person who is sick, not as a disease.
Despite the time lost to cancer treatment, Andy was still on track to graduate with his class in May 2005. He had already earned his white coat and stethoscope. Andrew D. Martin, born October 19th, 1972, deceased November 19th, 2004.
Dr. Curiel? until that night, I had always thought that I would be able to push through any sort of grueling physical outing, to arrive at a camp before sleeping. But as the hours wore on, sleeping on the trail seemed to be a more and more appealing option. As I crossed a bridge that night, I felt a sense of closure looking back at the mountain. It was a mere silhouette towering above us as the moon flickered off of the river below. It was an X that marked a wonderful spot in my memory, but the mountain seemed startlingly unchanged, so beautifully indifferent to my passing. Come away with me in the night. Come away with me, and I will write you a song. Thank you.
I've waited years for that. Can y'all hear me? Yes. So we would like to open up the floor now for some Q&A. And so if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come to you with the microphone. Anything you would like to ask Jason?
Let me maybe, oh, go ahead, yeah. I was going to say, or I can start it off a little 2-minute thing that may give a little background, but go ahead. If you got a question, go.
What year was he diagnosed again?
2000.
Okay.
So, yeah, so just the quick background. When I was a grad student at Ohio State in theater, we had to do something called solo site specific, meaning we had to do an original piece that had to occur somewhere other than a theater. And it could only be 10 minutes long. So I was listening to NPR or something like that, and I remember hearing about Tulane, Andy Martin. I just wrote his name on a scratch paper, Andy Martin. Like many of you, lives have been touched with cancer. My father passed at the age of 51 from melanoma. So my radar is always up for things, and I got this idea to research, and I found his sister who was selling jewelry to raise money for the Bounce for Life organization, which was the organization that basically paid for his time in the lab. So every fall, basically, he got diagnosed with another recurrence of cancer right before he started school. So I pitched this idea to the folks at the James Cancer Center at Ohio State. So the first time I performed it was in a lab with like 30 people. And I was committed to doing that performance and like 2 others before a script or anything existed, which my students will attest there's nothing more motivating than an opening night that's been set down. So in my digging, one of the nurses told me that he kept journals, and so I contacted the family, and in a huge act of faith and generosity, they gave me his diaries. And when I did it in a version of this in New York in 2007, and the family flew out from Los Angeles to see it, which was pretty awesome and scary, and all that. So this has been living in different versions since 2006, and this is sort of the latest version. I sort of think of this piece kind of as the cell line. It's the start of something. My buddy wrote a play inspired by this play that takes a lot more liberties in great ways, and family wants to do like a independent film project. So there's other things that are happening. But yeah, 2000, first time. He graduated from Harvard, and he was getting ready to go to medical school, and that's where the T-shirt comes from in the beginning. The opening text and the ending text come from a letter or an article he wrote in a wine connoisseur magazine before ever being diagnosed. And so I thought that just sort of, it was a nice way to bookend it for right now. But
I just saw the way you looked at like the box marked 2000, and I missed where he was like diagnosed in 2000. So I was like, oh wow, like you can still tell like the emotion behind 2000, like that year. It was a big year.
yeah. No, I just thought sometimes that helps people know that everything you heard he wrote, I just edited it and compiled it and moved it around, either from private diaries, articles he wrote. I transcribed a couple NPR interviews. There's a Pulitzer Prize-winning series of articles by a woman named Amy Doxer Marcus that did 3 series of articles based on this story. So I've lifted from different places. Yeah, before he ever had cancer. It's from the same thing where he's talking about the girl in California, same article. It's just an article about him bragging about his fish and wine pairings and trying to, have a romantic date. Right? Right. Those are the happy accidents, we call them. I was on a plane when I was working on this at one point, and I'm reading like a rock climbing magazine. And there was a quote in the beginning of the rock climbing magazine, and I'm just losing it, because he's talking about that it's not about climbing mountains, it's about, the person, it's about the, you miss the point if you think it's about scaling mountains. And I sometimes put that in the program. So, yeah.
So I'm not really good at picking out context clues, but that last part where you're looking through the microscope,
Yeah.
and you announce like that doctor's name, is that Mr. Martin like discovering something?
Well, I mean, I purposely leave it a little bit vague. What time is it, Carrie? Just so we know, we can try to pull up.
It's like 1:18, 1:20.
1:20. Okay. Do you want to try to switch over and find the video while we're talking? There's a great little video that I sometimes show and didn't know if we'd have time for it. But all you need to do is Google Nova Science Now, Dr. Curiel. And if we find it in time, we'll switch the displays over. It helps sort of tie up the loose ends. But basically, they saved the cell line, and then the next fall, after Andy died, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. And they lost all kinds of research. But they were able to save Andy's cells. And Dr. Curiel's now over in San Antonio, has taken the research with him. But it was just a little bit of dramatic license that there had to be a moment. I mean, if you can imagine, these cells are growing uncontrollably in your head, and you're sitting for hours and hours and hours and hours staring in a microscope, trying to get them to grow 1 foot lower. And at one point, there was movement, right? And he had to, and Dr. Curiel talks about coming in and being like, he was pretty skeptical, And, but sure enough. And so in my mind, that was sort of just a way to try to connect that moment. Yeah.
Thanks.
It's just a YouTube. You just got to go to YouTube and Nova Science Now, Curiel. This is Lou Columbus, by the way, is my good buddy. He's a great photographer and videographer in town, and he offered to run sound for me at the last minute. So thank you, Lou.
Hi, Jason.
Hey.
Are there any, the amount of cases, has that increased since that 2005 or stayed the
I
same?
think kind of steady. I haven't followed the research super closely, but it seems to be pretty consistent. There seem to be about 5 to 10 people alive with this particular strain of cancer at any one time.
And have they had any success with any people
They
since?
saved
Are
the
they getting
cells and they're
better?
continuing to research it, but like a lot of this stuff comes down to funding, and the rare cancers receive less funding. So it still exists, but I've not talked to Dr. Curiel in probably 2 or 3 years after he moved to San Antonio. But it still continues, and it's like so many things, waiting for funding.
So no idea of causes or no?
No, not me
cures?
personally.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
What happens if you have a rare form of cancer is they just use treatment protocols for other cancers that they do have, stats and numbers on. But Andy, what was pretty amazing is that Andy convinced Dr. Curiel to let him biopsy his own tumor. And they were afraid that the operation would make him go blind, and he found a way to go through his nose and sort of, the fact that he was able to, with only one tissue sample, start the line was pretty miraculous. Whereas, normally you would have many, many more tissue samples, to start. With all the bacteria and stuff in the sinuses, so it was one of those sort of miraculous things.
We're looking for the video.
That's cool. Yeah.
I think we found it.
Well, we found the video. That
For
wasn't
a
hard.
whole lot of reasons, meteorological,
We'll try to switch the
political, engineering
video over.
reasons,
Oh, cool.
Hurricane Katrina was a major science story last year. But now we're going to add one more reason. We're going to tell you a Katrina story about a young man who got very sick, but he had one bit of luck. He had a very unusual friend. Dr. Tyler Curiel, hold on a second, he's a hard man to keep up with. He runs 100-mile marathons. This is a man who's on his very own path. He goes where he wants to go. Now he's the chief of hematology and medical oncology at Tulane University, where he runs a lab that specializes in immune cells.
We look at the human immune response to cancers and to infections.
But Tyler had never seen anything or anyone like Andy Martin. In 2000, Andy Martin from California was just about to start medical school at Tulane.
A week before I started my first year, it showed up. I was on a vacation, like a last hurrah vacation, and started getting nosebleeds.
Andy was diagnosed with a very rare and very deadly cancer called SNUC.
SNUC is sinonasal undifferentiated carcinoma. Andy decided that he wanted to do research on his own cancer. He persuaded me to allow us to biopsy his tumor.
Andy said,
if this cancer is going to get me, damn it, I'm going to go down fighting, and make a difference, so that future people who are diagnosed with this don't have the same outcome that I had.
The student and his mentor worked side by side to try to find a treatment, even though both of them knew that Andy didn't have much time.
Tyler and him had a really good friendship, as well as, this amazing medical experience together.
Andy came over to our house for dinner many times. He enjoys wine tasting, particularly he was fond of ports.
When Andy was about to undergo chemotherapy and lose his taste, Tyler, a bit of a connoisseur, threw a wine tasting party. And Andy's classmates shaved their heads in solidarity. Andy is the bald guy in the middle.
The Balance for Life Marathon fundraiser will be December.
And the doctor raised money for his students' research by breaking a world's record. He dribbled a basketball for 24 hours while running a total of 108 miles.
He's crazy.
They generated a living cell line from Andy's tumor, the only known cell line of snuck in the world. And those cells outlived Andy. Already very sick, Andy Martin left home to visit friends at Tulane when he was overcome by cancer in November 2004.
When it came to that week, Tyler kind of took over as his personal physician, and he was there every day, at least one time, sometimes more. He passed away on a Friday night in New Orleans.
And when Hurricane Katrina struck at the heart of New Orleans, Tulane University was right in its path. People, homes, property were in serious danger, and so was a lot of science. Tyler decided to stay in his lab through the storm. He was joined by his colleague and his neighbor at the lab, Mike Brumlick. Together, they were determined to protect the millions of dollars of equipment there and the research and Andy Martin's cells.
These cells were very important. This was personal.
Number one thing I knew we had to save was we had to get the Andy Martin snuck cells out.
Their plan was simple: keep all the samples dry and cold enough to survive just a brief loss of power. They spent the whole weekend hard at work.
We had consolidated all of our things into 3 or 4 freezers.
Monday morning, the storm brought winds stronger than 150 miles an hour.
It was like the Wizard of Oz. We'd look out the window and gigantic pieces of buildings would just go blowing by.
By the time the storm ended, their building was running on an emergency generator, but the samples were fine. Tyler went to the phone to tell friends everything was okay.
Mike Brumlick walked into my office. We're in Tulane Medical School in my office, and he said, you might want to look out the window.
And he does this, and of course his jaw drops because he realizes more or less what I realized, which is that we are in very deep trouble.
I looked out the window and saw that we were flooded. I had no idea. As far as our research goes, this is the worst case scenario. It doesn't get any worse.
Suddenly, it's a race against time. The men try to move a 400-pound freezer down 6 stories and across this pedway to the building next door, which has better emergency power. It takes them all day to move the samples, and when they finally make it to the other building, the generator there is almost underwater.
Generator's not in a safe place. 6 more inches of water rising and the generator is toast. So we are effectively doomed at this point.
You don't want to be melodramatic, but I was thinking, this is my whole life's work, and it's melting.
And the power fails at about 5 p.m. on Tuesday, and that's it. The only place to save anything cold is the liquid nitrogen tanks.
The problem is liquid nitrogen will evaporate, which means that the samples have maybe 10 days, and then they'll melt.
And you're looking around, the city's flooded, and you're thinking, it's going to be months before we can come back in here. We had no idea.
The next morning, after Tyler and Mike had packed everything they could into the liquid nitrogen, they get another surprise. This one comes in uniform.
You've got 2 minutes to get out, evacuate, or you're going in handcuffs. It was bang, and they've got big rifles on their back. And you don't argue with people like this. I couldn't find my shoes. And I kept telling them, I'm just looking for my shoes. And I said, buddy, you're going in the cuffs. We left our food behind, we left our water behind, and we were off.
Tyler was headed to Charity Hospital, where there were still hundreds of patients.
I'd been there a few times and saw how desperate conditions were. Mike said, if you're going to Charity, I'm going to Charity.
I had done everything I could do to protect the science, and now it was time to help people.
Tyler and Mike hopped into a canoe they'd been keeping handy.
We'd shove off and we'd paddle right out through that exit right there.
And then they paddled a couple of blocks down to Charity, where Tyler's wife, Ruth Berggren, was one of the doctors in charge.
He said, what can I do for you? And I thought about it and I said, honestly, I need you to go fetch water. So here's my brilliant husband, the scientist, the immunologist. He actually said to me, he said, I'm a perfect person for this job.
By now, these guys had seen just about everything.
We had already been flooded in for 4 or 5 days. Food was low, water was low. We'd been without electricity for a number of days. It was very hot. Conditions were terrible.
They had successfully evacuated the patients at Charity Hospital.
So I realized, time's up. You have to go.
But remember, the clock was ticking. It had been 3 days since Tyler put his lab samples into the liquid nitrogen. He had a week, maybe less, to keep them from melting, including the cells of Andy Martin.
It was scary. It was a very scary time. And my mom even said, it's like Andy dying all over again.
From Dallas, Tyler worked the phones for almost a week. He got a jet, coolers, and now he and Mike raced back to New Orleans.
Now the lab smells bad because we have freezer stuff and fridge stuff that's perished, so it doesn't smell pretty. But preying on our mind is, did the nitrogen make it?
And we had the 3 liquid nitrogen containers lined up, 1, 2, 3. I turned to Mike, I said, Mike, I'm gonna lift the lid, and if it's warm in there and the samples are thawed, game's over. And he said, do it.
Together we lift the lid, and this plume of vapor hits us in the face.
It was really cold, it was really white. That's what it's supposed to look like.
By chance, out of all the samples inside all 3 freezers, the first box that Tyler pulled out contained Andy Martin cells, frozen, safe, and sound.
I was calling everybody, oh, they made it out.
So we were high-fiving and just going, yeah.
One of the port wines that Andy liked, he actually had a bottle, and it's still at my parents' house, and Tyler had made some crack about celebrating. I said, well, I have one of Andy's bottles of Fonseca, you know, I can ship it to you wherever you want. He said, no, I'd like it if you would save that, and we can all celebrate together when we see each other again.
Andy's cells were saved, but Tyler lost a lot of research, and he's not alone.
My sense is that we've lost millions of dollars worth of research, thousands of man-hours of research, and then you multiply that times hundreds of investigators, and it's staggering.
But Tyler knows how to stay on his feet.
How about that?
His home wasn't too damaged, and he had to shift his lab work to different cities for a while. But New Orleans is calling. And it won't be long before Tyler's whole operation is back, up and running.
Yeah, right. So usually when there's not a time limit, usually I show that before I even come back out. So this is sort of because I feel like it fills in blanks and frames the story nicely. My buddy who wrote another play, he saw all this and incorporated something and created a whole new piece. So I know we're at time, so I don't want to keep anybody, but I'll hang out for a few minutes. But I really appreciate y'all coming out and supporting the citizen science events that occur and seeing this piece. It's special to me, and as I know many of you, probably all of us have had our lives touched by cancer in one way or another. This one's particularly special for me to work on. The collaboration between healthcare and the arts, I think, is very important. So thank you for having me, Carrie. Yeah.
Thank you. Again, thank you so much for coming, everyone. We really appreciate it. Please be looking out for our next Citizen Science on March the 31st, same time, same place. Thank you.